28 now, married to the love of my life, and we're expecting our first child in 3 months. But the road to this happiness wasn't easy, and it definitely didn't include my father. Not until recently, anyway, when he suddenly decided he wanted back into my life because I'm carrying his grandchild. Let me start from the beginning, because the context matters here. My mom died when I was 15. Cancer took her after a brutal 2-year fight that drained our family emotionally and financially. Dad was devastated. We both were, but I thought we'd get through it together. For about 6 months after the funeral, it was just him and me figuring out how to live without her. We ordered too much takeout, forgot to do laundry until we were both wearing wrinkled clothes, and spent most evenings sitting in comfortable silence watching old movies Mom used to love. Then Dad met Vanessa. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't one of those kids who hated every woman their parent dated after losing the other parent. I understood that Dad was lonely. I understood that he deserved to find love again. What I didn't understand was how quickly he seemed to forget that I existed once Vanessa entered the picture. Vanessa was everything my mom wasn't. Where Mom had been warm and nurturing, Vanessa was cold and calculating. Where Mom had made our house feel like a home filled with laughter and inside jokes, Vanessa made it feel like a museum where I was constantly afraid of breaking something valuable. She was beautiful, sure, and she knew how to charm my dad when I wasn't around. But the moment he left for work each morning, her mask slipped. It started small. Comments about how I left dishes in the sink or how I tracked mud through the house. Criticisms about my clothes, my grades, my friends. Nothing big enough for Dad to notice when I tried to bring it up, but constant enough that I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own home. She'd remind me constantly how hard Dad worked, how I should be helping out more around the house. Every conversation became about her needs, her comfort, her vision for their future together. And somehow, that vision never seemed to include me. The wedding happened 8 months after they met. I wasn't asked to be involved in the planning, wasn't consulted about anything. I found out the date from my aunt, who had received an invitation in the mail. When I asked Dad why I hadn't been included, he brushed it off by saying Vanessa was handling all the details and wanted to keep things simple. The ceremony was at some fancy country club, and I felt completely out of place in my second-hand suit while Vanessa's family strutted around in designer everything. During the reception, I watched my dad dance with his new wife, looking happier than I'd seen him since before Mom got sick. Part of me was glad for him. Most of me felt like I was watching a stranger. That's when things really started to change at home. Suddenly, every conversation became about what Vanessa needed or wanted. She wanted to redecorate the living room, so all of Mom's furniture disappeared while I was at school one day. She wanted to turn Mom's old craft room into her home office, so all of Mom's sewing supplies and scrapbooking materials got shoved into boxes and stored in the garage. When I asked Dad about it, he said we needed to move forward and make the house feel like theirs now. Theirs, not ours. The breaking point came 3 months after the wedding, just after my 17th birthday. I'd been accepted to State University with a partial academic scholarship, something I'd worked incredibly hard for. The plan had always been that I'd live at home for the first 2 years to save money, then transfer to a 4-year school to finish my degree. Mom and I had talked about it constantly before she died. Dad had always been supportive of the plan. But when Vanessa found out I'd be staying home for college, she lost it completely. The conversation happened over dinner, and it became clear immediately that this wasn't a discussion, it was a decree. Vanessa made it abundantly clear that she hadn't married Dad to play stepmother to a teenager for the next 4 years. She thought it was time for me to grow up and learn independence. I looked at Dad, waiting for him to stand up for me, to remind her that this was my home too. Instead, he just sat there, cutting his steak into smaller and smaller pieces, agreeing that maybe it would be good for me to experience dorm life and build character. When I pointed out that we couldn't afford the dorms, that the scholarship only covered tuition and room and board would cost more than I made at my part-time job, Vanessa waved her hand dismissively. I should get a better job, take out loans, figure it out, that's what adults do. I felt something crack inside my chest when I tried to explain that this was my home, that Mom and I had planned this together. Vanessa cut me off sharply, reminding me that my mother wasn't here anymore and this was her house now. She'd been patient, but she was done tiptoeing around my feelings. I was 17 years old, and it was time to act like it. Again, I looked at Dad. Again, he said nothing. That night, I called my Aunt Lucy, Mom's sister, and told her what happened. She was furious, but not surprised. She'd never liked Vanessa and had been vocal about Dad's quick remarriage. She lived 2 states away, but immediately offered to let me stay with her while I figured things out. 2 weeks later, I was packing my belongings into garbage bags while Dad stood in the doorway of my bedroom, looking uncomfortable but not intervening. He kept saying this didn't have to be permanent. Maybe after I got on my feet we could work something out. But I could see through his weak attempts at reconciliation. I stopped packing and looked at him, really looked at him. I told him exactly what I thought. He was letting his wife kick his son out of his home because she didn't want to deal with me, and he was standing there making excuses for it. When he opened his mouth to respond, I held up my hand and said the words that would haunt both of us for years. Mom would be ashamed of him. She'd spent her last 2 years worrying about what would happen to me after she was gone, and he was abandoning me. I finished packing in silence. Dad helped me load my car, but didn't say goodbye. As I drove away from the house where I'd spent most of my childhood, I made myself a promise. I was done hoping for scraps of attention from a man who'd chosen his new wife over his own child. Aunt Lucy was everything I needed during that time. She helped me apply for additional financial aid, drove me to campus orientations, and never once made me feel like I was a burden. She'd always been Mom's fiercer sister, the one who spoke her mind and didn't suffer fools, and she had some choice words about Dad's behavior. She called him a coward, desperate to keep his new wife happy even if it meant sacrificing his own son. But she also reminded me that his loss was exactly that, his loss, not mine. College was hard but good. I worked 3 part-time jobs to cover expenses, studied constantly, and slowly build a life that had nothing to do with my father or his choices. I made friends who became like family. I met professors who believed in me. I discovered I had a talent for computer programming and switched my major to software engineering. And I met Bella. Bella was in my statistics class, always sitting in the front row with color-coded notes and the kind of focused attention that made me want to try harder. She was smart and funny and had this way of making even the most boring lecture feel like an adventure. When I finally worked up the courage to ask her out junior year, she said yes with this smile that made me understand why people write songs about falling in love. We dated through the rest of college, moved in together after graduation, and built something I'd never really believed possible, a relationship based on mutual respect, honest communication, and the kind of partnership where we both felt heard and valued. When I proposed 3 years later, she cried and said yes before I could even finish my prepared speech. Dad found out about our engagement through social media. I'd posted a photo of Bella showing off her ring, and within hours, my phone was buzzing with a call from a number I'd blocked years earlier. When I didn't answer, he started calling Aunt Lucy. She told me he wanted to talk, that he missed me, and wanted to be part of my life again. When I asked what she'd told him, she said that ship had sailed when he chose his wife over his son, but the decision was mine to make. I thought about it for weeks. Part of me, the part that was still 17 and desperate for his approval, wanted to call him back. But the rational part of me, the part that had spent years building a life without him, knew better. If he'd wanted a relationship with me, he could have fought for it when it mattered. I didn't call him back. The wedding was perfect. Small ceremony, just our closest friends and the family members who'd actually been present in our lives. Aunt Lucy walked me down the aisle, and I'd never felt more grateful for the people who'd chosen to love me unconditionally. Dad wasn't there. I didn't invite him. For 2 years, Bella and I focused on building our careers and enjoying married life. I got promoted to senior developer at a tech company downtown. Bella finished her master's degree in social work and landed her dream job at a nonprofit that helps at-risk youth. We bought a little house with a fenced yard and adopted a rescue dog named Charlie. Life was good. When we found out Bella was pregnant, we were over the moon. We'd been trying for about 6 months, and seeing those 2 pink lines felt like the final piece of our family puzzle clicking into place. We spent hours talking about names, nursery themes, and all the ways we wanted to be different from our own parents. Bella made it clear that our child would know they were loved unconditionally. No matter what happened between us, no matter who else came into our lives, this baby would always know they came first. I thought about my own childhood then, about how secure I'd felt when it was just Mom, Dad, and me. How that security had crumbled so quickly when Dad chose his new wife's comfort over his son's well-being. I agreed completely, family first, always. We announced the pregnancy on social media at 12 weeks, sharing a photo of Charlie wearing a Big Brother bandana. The response from our friends and chosen family was overwhelming, so much love and excitement that I felt like my heart might burst. That's when Dad started reaching out again. First, it was a friend request on social media. I ignored it. Then he started following Bella's accounts, liking her pregnancy update posts. When that didn't get a response, he reached out to Aunt Lucy again. She told me he was persistent, that he wanted to be a grandfather to my baby, that he'd realized he made mistakes and wanted to make things right. When I asked if she'd told him that making things right wasn't his call to make, she said she had. But she also mentioned that Vanessa had left him about 6 months ago, apparently finding someone with more money and fewer complications. I wish I could say I felt bad for him. I wish I could say that news made me want to reach out and comfort him. But honestly, all I felt was a bitter kind of satisfaction. He'd chosen her over me, and she'd still left him when something better came along. A week later, Dad showed up at my office. I was walking out to the parking garage after work when I saw him leaning against my car. He looked older than I remembered, grayer around the temples, with new lines around his eyes. For a moment, I considered turning around and going back inside, but I knew this conversation had to happen eventually. He greeted me like nothing had changed, calling me son, but I shut that down immediately. I asked what he wanted, and he launched into his prepared speech about wanting to talk, to apologize, to be part of my life again. I told him he was 11 years too late for that conversation. He tried to frame his behavior as mistakes, but I corrected him sharply. He hadn't made mistakes, he'd made choices. He'd chosen Vanessa over me, repeatedly for years. He'd chosen to let her kick me out rather than stand up for his own child. He'd chosen to cut me out of his life completely. Those weren't accidents or oversights, they were deliberate decisions. He looked down at the ground and admitted he'd been a coward, so desperate to keep Vanessa happy and avoid conflict that he'd failed me completely. He even acknowledged that he'd failed my mother's memory. Hearing him mention Mom hurt more than I expected. Then he told me he'd heard about the baby, that he wanted to be a grandfather, to be in his grandchild's life. I asked him why. Why now? Was it because Vanessa had left him and he was lonely? Because he'd suddenly realized what he'd thrown away? Where was this desire for family when I graduated college? When I got married? When I needed him? He said he'd been ashamed, that the longer it went on, the harder it became to reach out. He didn't know how to fix what he'd broken. I told him the truth. He couldn't fix it. He'd made his choice, and now I was making mine. As I walked around to the driver's side, he pleaded with me to think about it, for the baby's sake. I paused with my hand on the door handle and said that was rich, coming from someone who'd abandoned his own child for his wife's convenience. I drove away without looking back, but his words stayed with me. That night, I told Bella about the encounter. When she asked what I wanted to do, I was honest. I wanted him to disappear and leave us alone, but I knew he wasn't going to give up easily. I was worried about what would happen when other people started pressuring us to give him a chance. I was right to be worried. Over the next month, Dad launched what could only be described as a campaign to insert himself back into my life. He sent flowers to Bella's office with notes apologizing for missing our relationship. He mailed cards to our house, birthday cards for birthdays he'd missed, anniversary cards, even a belated wedding card. He started showing up at places where he knew I'd be. The grocery store where I shopped, the coffee shop near my office, even at Charlie's vet clinic. Each time, he'd try to start a conversation about the baby, about how he'd changed, about how much he regretted the past. Each time, I walked away. The breaking point came when Bella's mom, Patricia, called to tell us she'd invited Dad to our baby shower. I was stunned. Patricia tried to justify it before I could get upset, explaining that he'd reached out to her through my aunt and sounded so genuinely sorry. He wanted to be part of this baby's life, and she believed everyone deserved a second chance. Bella gently reminded her mother that this wasn't her decision to make, but Patricia pushed back. Family was important, she argued. This baby was going to need all the love they could get, and cutting off their grandfather seemed unnecessarily harsh. I felt that familiar anger building in my chest, the same feeling I'd had at 17 when adults made decisions about my life without consulting me. I asked if he'd told her why we didn't have a relationship, and after a pause, she said he'd mentioned they'd had a falling out when I was younger. A falling out. I laughed bitterly and asked if that's what he'd called it. I explained the truth, that he'd let his second wife kick me out of my home when I was 17 years old, that he'd chosen her comfort over his child's well-being, repeatedly, for years. That wasn't a falling out, that was abandonment. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, clearly not expecting the severity of what had actually happened. When I asked her to uninvite him, she protested weakly that the shower was the next day and she couldn't just call him off. Bella took the phone and made it clear, if Dad showed up, we were leaving. This was our baby shower, not a family reunion. If Patricia wanted us there, he couldn't be. After a lot of back and forth, Patricia finally agreed to call Dad and disinvite him. But I had a feeling it wasn't going to be that simple. The shower was being held at Patricia's country club, a beautiful venue with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the golf course. Bella looked radiant in a flowing blue dress that perfectly showed off her 7-month bump. I wore my best suit and tried to focus on celebrating our upcoming arrival instead of worrying about unwanted guests. For the first hour, everything went perfectly. Bella's friends and co-workers mingled with our couple friends and the family members who'd actually been present in our lives. We played silly games, opened gifts, and I felt that familiar warmth of being surrounded by people who genuinely cared about us. Then I saw him. Dad was standing near the entrance, scanning the room. He dressed up for the occasion, navy blazer, pressed khakis, a tie I remembered from my childhood. Patricia was hovering near him, gesticulating frantically, clearly trying to convince him to leave. I excused myself from the conversation I'd been having and walked over to them. I reminded him quietly that I'd told him not to come, trying not to cause a scene. He acknowledged that he knew, but insisted this was his grandchild we were celebrating. He brought a gift, and I could see his hand shaking slightly as he held up a small wrapped box. I told him I didn't care what he'd brought, he needed to leave. He begged for just a few minutes, promising he wouldn't cause any trouble. He just wanted to be part of this. Patricia looked between us nervously, suggesting maybe we could work something out, but I shut that down firmly. I reminded her that she'd promised he wouldn't be here. Either he left, or we did. The conversation was starting to draw attention from other guests. Bella appeared at my side, her hand finding mine, asking what was going on though she'd clearly figured it out. I told her he was leaving, but Dad's voice got louder as he explained that he'd missed 11 years of my life because he'd been too proud and scared to fight for our relationship. He couldn't miss any more. This baby was his chance to be the grandfather he should have been as a father. Several people had stopped their conversations now, turning to watch our family drama unfold at what was supposed to be a joyful celebration. I told him he didn't get to decide that. He'd given up the right to be part of my family when he chose Vanessa over me, when he'd let her kick me out rather than standing up for his own child. He started crying, admitting he'd been wrong but insisting that people make mistakes and families forgive each other. That's when something inside me snapped. All the years of hurt, all the nights I'd lain awake wondering why I wasn't worth fighting for, all the major life events he'd missed because he'd chosen his wife's comfort over his son's well-being, it all came pouring out. I asked him loudly enough for the now silent room to hear what he thought real family looked like. I gestured around the room at our guests, my Aunt Lucy, who took me in when he threw me out, Bella's parents, who'd treated me like a son from day one, our friends who'd been there for every important moment in our lives. That was family. People who choose to love you unconditionally, who show up when things get hard, who don't abandon you the moment it becomes inconvenient. Dad's face was crumpling, but I wasn't done. I told him he talked about being a grandfather like it was a right he'd earned, but being a grandparent wasn't about biology. It was about being present, consistent, trustworthy. It was about proving that you'd put that child's needs above your own comfort. And he'd never done that, not for me, and not for anyone. The room was completely silent now. Even the staff had stopped moving, transfixed by the scene unfolding. I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the space as I explained what he really needed to understand about families and forgiveness. Real families don't abandon their children when things get complicated. Real families don't let new spouses push their kids aside. Real families show up. And he hadn't. For 11 years, he hadn't. I took a deep breath, feeling 11 years of pain and anger finally finding their voice. I told him this baby would grow up knowing exactly what unconditional love looked like because they'd be surrounded by people who'd proven they knew how to give it. He wasn't one of those people. He'd had his chance to be my father, and he'd chosen not to take it. He didn't get a second chance with my child. Dad was crying openly now, and I could see several of our guests wiping their eyes as well. He whispered that he was begging me to let him try to make this right. I looked at him for a long moment, this man who'd helped create me but had never really chosen to be my father when it mattered most. I told him quietly that the time to make it right was 11 years ago, when I needed him most and he wasn't there. I couldn't risk putting my child through what he'd put me through. I wouldn't. I turned to Patricia and told her he needed to leave immediately. She nodded, finally understanding the gravity of what had happened, and gently took Dad's arm, suggesting they go. As they walked toward the exit, Dad turned back one more time and said he loved me, that he'd always loved me. I replied simply that love wasn't enough. It never was. After they left, the party slowly resumed, but the mood had shifted. People were gentler, more thoughtful. Several guests came up to me throughout the rest of the afternoon to share their own stories about difficult family relationships and the importance of choosing the people who truly see your worth. Bella's grandmother, A tiny woman in her 80s who rarely spoke above a whisper, pulled me aside as we were leaving. She told me firmly that I'd done the right thing. A parent's job is to protect their child, even from other family members if necessary. That's what I'd just done for my baby. That night, as Bella and I lay in bed surrounded by baby gifts and the warm glow of being celebrated by people who truly loved us, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete peace with my decision. Bella asked if I was okay, her hand resting on her belly. I told her honestly that I was better than okay. For the first time in 11 years, I felt like I could stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to disappoint me again. Our daughter was born 2 months later, a perfect, healthy baby girl we named Hope. As I held her for the first time, looking into her tiny face, I made her the same promise I'd made to myself years earlier. She would never have to wonder if she was loved unconditionally. She would never have to compete for attention or affection. She would never have to question whether she was worth fighting for. Dad never met her. He sent cards and gifts that we donated to charity, but he never met her. And honestly, I've never regretted that decision, because Hope is surrounded by people who chose to love her from the moment they knew she existed. She has grandparents who traveled across the country to be there for her birth. She has aunts and uncles who send care packages and video call just to hear her laugh. She has parents who learned from their own childhood experiences exactly what not to do. That's what real family looks like. And that's the only kind of family I want my daughter to know.